Catherine, I don't know if you realize that my great grandfather actually crossed the border way back in the 20s, and he came at the wrong time because he started an underground distillery right during Prohibition.
What? No way.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I think they all knew back then that it was a whiskey business.
Hello and welcome to the Foretop. It's a roundtable discussion of today's hot button topics in the wine and food world. I am your host, Catherine Cole, joined by co-host Martin Reyes, MW. Hey, Martin, I'm really looking forward to this episode. We kind of wanted to call it Poison, or maybe Smashing the Liquor Machine, or maybe repealing our ideas about prohibition. I guess when this episode comes out, you'll see what we finally decided on.
I like that. Catherine, until oof, man, until I prepared for this episode, I think most of us in the wine industry thought that prohibition, it was a terrible law. It devastated the wine industry, hospitality, restaurant, wine business, and of course, family farmers. They were forced to rip out their vineyards, their livelihood, diverted, and it was a challenge. And even today, wine professionals continue to complain about what is our biggest pet peeve, the convoluted three-tier distribution system that came out of Prohibition.
And yet, no, I agree. And the wine industry seems to be completely against prohibition without realizing the full history of it. And I do, every December 5th, it's the anniversary of the repeal of prohibition. And I
Hmm.
get emails and cards from wineries, and I see on their social media feeds that they're celebrating, they have parties. And I think we need to do this episode so people understand that, yes, the three-tier distribution system, which came out of prohibition, is annoying. Yes, it's a nightmare to navigate, but there was a
Hmm.
reason for this law to be passed.
It
And
was a reason. It's a reason we can relate to today,
yeah, I
among many
mean,
other reasons. Right? Yes, that's what's
yeah.
fascinating.
And so I think we sure learned a lot researching this episode, and I can't wait for our listeners to hear what our guests have to say.
Yes, yes, yes.
And on that note, we are joined today by Moira Donegan. She's a columnist at The Guardian, and she's been a leader in the Me Too movement. And she has written about the misunderstood prohibitionist Carrie Nation. I'm really excited to hear from her.
And then of course, we have Mark Lawrence Schrad, an associate professor of political science at Villanova University, and author, most recently, of a fascinating book entitled "Smashing the Liquor Machine: A Global History of Prohibition." Okay, so let's get to it.
All right.
So, Mark, your book, Smashing the Liquor Machine, it recounts this eye-opening history behind prohibition that will come as a surprise to most of our listeners. It certainly did for me. It describes the alcohol industry's methodical oppression of disenfranchised populations. And I'm just thinking to myself, could you give us a few examples of these groups of people? Like, who were they? How was alcohol used to exploit them? And why did they need prohibition?
Right. My own background is in sort of comparative politics and Russian politics. My previous book was on vodka and recognizing that vodka in a Russian context was sort of an instrument of state power. It was the way that the rich got rich, whether it was the czars or the commissars, and the poor got poorer. And, that was the thing, getting people addicted to alcohol and then essentially sucking them dry was just sort of the way things were done. And actually, a number of years ago, I gave a presentation based on that book in Russian, and I thought they were going to rake me over the coals because I'm airing out dirty laundry, Russia's dirty laundry, and they essentially were indifferent to it. They said, yeah, that's what all countries do. All countries before income tax, they sold alcohol to their own people and made a killing over it. That's just the way the world worked. And I said, oh, I should probably figure that out. I should probably look around. And so that's what I did. I kind of looked, first in Russia and then all these different countries of Europe and was seeing that, the usual explanations for why we had prohibition in the United States, that it was Bible thumping Midwestern evangelical Protestants, didn't seem to hold water in a lot of the rest of the world. And so what you find in the rest of the world is that, the liquor industry, and predominantly it's distilled liquor that I end up looking at, less so, wine and beer, the fermented beverages. Even though we kind of all lump them together as alcohol, it's mostly distilled liquors, your rums and your whiskeys and your vodkas. Those ended up being these potent, sort of instruments of colonization and oppression in many cases. And so it was very strange to learn that the people who were in the rest of the world, who were the biggest proponents of prohibition, were sort of disenfranchised communities. So Africans in colonial Africa, in South Africa, and in Zimbabwe, or looking at in India, looking at Gandhi and the non-cooperation movement. Gandhi was a prohibitionist, and it wasn't that he necessarily saw alcohol as an evil, but he understood that was the pillar of imperialism, of British imperialism. That is how the Indians were funding their own oppression, was by drinking up. And so whether it was in India or Australia or South Africa or any of these different countries, you found that it was a movement not against alcohol, not against the stuff that was in the cup or the bottle, but it was against this sort of system of predatory capitalism, of people, using a highly addictive substance to sort of subjugate other people and to make lots of money from that. And so that's, very different from the way that we kind of contemporarily understand the alcohol industry today.
Mark, that's eye-opening, and we know about prohibition. We almost joke about it and what it was and how lame that was, and we equate it to whatever oppressive, puritanical philosophies are there. And yet the cursory, anybody who has a cursory understanding of this has a very different idea of what this was than what you're telling us. This is eye-opening.
Mark, in the wine industry, people are constantly complaining about the 3-tier system of distribution, which was put in place during Prohibition.
It's strange. I mean, the policy machinations sort of back and forth, that a lot of the policy debates were happening at the state level. You had dry states, you had sort of liquor control states, and you had ones with large amounts of sort of taxes on these things, and they all kind of got crowded out with prohibition. And once national prohibition comes in, that that becomes sort of the de facto policy. But then when you get to repeal, you suddenly have the revisiting of all these different policy options, that had been happening 12 years earlier, 12 plus years earlier. And so, and a lot of those policy debates that you were having in the 1930s result in the sort of the alcohol policies that we see today. I'm here in Pennsylvania. When I first came here, it blew my mind that, you couldn't go to the local beer store to get a 6-pack of beer. You go to the beer store, you have to buy a case or more. If you want anything less than a case, you have to go to a bar, which made absolutely no sense. But, the idea was that this was sort of the holdover from the Prohibition era in the 1930s. So, yeah, these laws that you have, especially, coming after Prohibition, they tend to be really sticky. They tend to stick around for a long time and are very, very difficult to change.
And yet, we think of those laws as being symbols of the failure of Prohibition. And in fact, I guess what I'm hearing is actually they were successes, because they're putting some stops in place from keeping people from becoming addicted to alcohol.
My narrative is all upside down here. I'm sorry. Wow.
But yeah, I mean, the one thing that really got me, and we're talking about these insights that just kind of change the way you're thinking completely. I start the book off with a vignette of Carrie Nation. She was probably the world's most famous prohibitionist, and famous for going into saloons in Kansas and smashing them up and sending the barflies out, and all that. And what the little nugget of sort of empirical history that really kind of shook me or stuck with me was that when Carrie Nation was doing her saloon smashings, she was usually doing them between 7 and 8 o'clock in the morning. So, the idea was that these are people who had been drinking all night. The bars did not close, and the barkeepers would not send you home if you had had enough. The idea was that you get somebody drunk and you just keep them there and keep feeding them alcohol. You don't you don't do the Ted Danson at Cheers thing and pack them in a cab and send them home. they're there to make you money, and any sort of sending out a drunkard into the street is just money that you're not going to get from him. And so that blew my mind to think about that. But it also made me recognize that the realities of sort of the liquor industry and saloon keepers and so on from the pre-Prohibition era are completely different from what we have now after Prohibition. And so in some ways, if you understand that Prohibition wasn't against the liquor in the bottle, and it wasn't sort of Bible thumping about the morality of the drinker per se, but it was actually about the system of predatory capitalism. After Prohibition, you have all these regulations in place. You could actually see it as something of a success.
That's so interesting. And Moira, let's get you in here. I'm really curious to hear from you. Carrie Nation, Mark mentioned, is just this symbol, this cliched image we have of this prim and bespectacled woman in her black dress wielding the original battle axe. And I think the idea that we have in our mind today about Carrie Nation is totally wrong. And you've written about that. So tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I have a real soft spot for Carrie Nation. And you're right that there's this popular perception of her, the one that, I remember from my high school history textbook, is of a old lady wearing teeny weeny little glasses and a frown and clutching a hatchet. And she was depicted as this extremist zealot who was against fun and was out to ruin everybody's fun. And the real Carrie Nation, who emerges from history when you look into who she was, is a much more dynamic character. And she's a big figure in Mark's book as well. But she is a woman who was from Kansas. She was a farmer's daughter. She lived this very sheltered life, and along comes to town a doctor who was a veteran of the Union Army, and she fall absolutely in love, and her mom tells her not to do it, but she marries him anyway, and within 16 months he's dead because his drinking progressed really fast to a really unmanageable state. He was out all night drinking away all their money. Carrie's parents came to visit her during this brief first marriage, and they found her dirty and hungry and cold and alone and pregnant. And she had this great hope for, it had been a love match. She had this great hope for this guy and the life that they were going to live together. His name was Charles Gloyd. And she got really dramatically disillusioned. And she has this early, abrupt loss of innocence. And so, she carries this with her all her life. She doesn't immediately start going out with a hatchet smashing bars. She gets really involved with her church. She marries again, kind of for convenience, to this guy named David Nation. But she is an active member of her community, and she's seeing the same thing happen to other women. She's seeing women get sort of destroyed by these husbands who are really prolifically alcoholic. And I think it's important to remember that when we talk about alcohol consumption in the 19th century, it's really on a different order of magnitude to what we talk about with alcohol consumption now. It's, as Mark mentioned, 24 hours a day. There are no laws against over-serving. There's not a lot of scrupulousness on the part of liquor sellers. And it's just in much, much greater quantities. There's most of the estimates I have read said it's about 3 times greater median consumption. So something like 7.5 gallons of pure distilled alcohol per person per year.
Well, that makes me feel better about how much I drink.
Yeah, it's about 3 times as much as the average drinker drinks now.
Makes me feel better too. Thanks, Catherine, for that. Yeah.
Those of us in the wine industry. Wow. And is there any indication that it was more addictive in any way? Was it doctored with anything, or was it stronger?
Well, there had been sort of this push post-Revolutionary War and a shift more towards distilled spirits, whereas, Carrie Nation's maybe her father, her grandfather would have drank a low ABV beer or hard cider. Her husband was drinking whiskeys and rums, and around the same time in the UK, there's a massive influx of popularity of gin. So in general, people are drinking hard stuff, and they're drinking all the time. And by people, I really mean men. Alcohol consumption at this point in time is very gendered. It's not that women don't drink, it's that they don't drink in anything like the quantities men do. And in general, saloons, these tend to be male-only spaces. There aren't a lot of women in there other than proprietors and prostitutes. It's a male pastime that gets disproportionately meted out with, female consequences. Because at this point in time, women, and particularly married women, don't have a ton of rights. Their work is low paid, much lower paid than men's work is. It's sort of looked down on. It's not enough to support yourself. And the wages that you do earn, you don't have control over them because that is your husband's property. The first law against wife beating is passed in Tennessee in 1850. But wife beating is still a very common and in some places legally protected element of marriage. It's called the right of marital chastisement. And it's, there are laws on the books and a lot of case law in effect at this time that protects men's right to beat their wives. Marital rape won't be illegal in the United States until 1993. And, there's not a ton of recourse for a woman who's married to an alcoholic. She doesn't have the right to divorce. She doesn't have the right to keep him from taking her money and drinking it. She doesn't have a right to stop him from coming home drunk and beating her up. And, men are doing this in pretty large numbers. And that's when women start to take action.
Wow. And you just reminded me, I remember there was a bar in Chicago that didn't allow women until, I want to say, the late 90s. I need to look it up. But yeah, women didn't used to even be allowed in many bars. And you've written, Moira, that when Curie Nation took her axe up, she was taking that axe up in defense, I'm quoting from your article, she took her axe to the bottles. She saw herself as taking an axe to the forces that enabled domestic violence, sexual harassment, and rape. I don't think anyone in the alcohol industry today has thought of prohibition from that point of view.
No, I don't think so.
No.
Yeah, it's interesting because our ideas about what's acceptable, what's normal, these change a lot, right? Especially when you're looking at within marriages or within families. When I was growing up, it was really normal for parents to spank their kids, and that has become way less normal now. And what you see with the temperance movement, which I conceptualize this end of the temperance movement as really being a mass movement by women against domestic violence. You see women sort of rising up to say, wait, this is actually a problem that we're getting hit by and abandoned and neglected by our drunken husbands. We are articulating that it is a problem. We are articulating what we feel is the cause of the problem. And in Carrie Nation's case, and in the case of a lot of women who took up this direct action, they were directly intervening against what they saw as the cause of the suffering in their lives.
Mark, I've heard you say that there is a parallel in today's society, which is the opioid epidemic.
We can't imagine a place where, you could pass a constitutional amendment and get, 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of all the states to agree to something, to take away our freedoms, right? And so it gets wrapped up in this freedom rhetoric. And so since we can't sort of wrap our minds around that, we end up coming up with all these caricatures and vilifying people, right? So that was one of my articles, was trying to figure out, well, how do we understand that you could have a sort of a majority of the population in favor of this thing that we now think of as kind of crazy and kind of abhorrent? And so sort of making a parallel to the opioid epidemic, I think, is probably the most direct one. So suggesting that if you think it's okay for the Sackler family to make billions of dollars pushing opioids, highly addictive opioids on people, and then making out with a basket load of money, well, that's on you. But I mean, if you have a problem with that, 100 years ago, you were probably marching in the temperance ranks. It wasn't just a thing about just women, although women were part of that sort of disenfranchised bunch. Every time I see somebody like a troll online say women's suffrage, that's why they wanted to get the vote, was to take away your freedom to drink. I just like, wait, 18th Amendment came before 19th Amendment. Prohibition came before the vote, right? So there was only one woman, Jeanette Rankin, the only female member of the House of Representatives. She's the only one who voted for prohibition. Everybody else was a guy. Everybody else, all the other senators, congressmen, all of them were dudes. So the idea that this was just some secret cabal, I think, is more of a product of generations of anti-women sentiment.
Catherine and I, we've gone through pockets of different stories, uncovering unique new perspectives related to wine and alcohol with multiple guests, and there's always this eye-opening moment in which, whether history was written or rewritten by those in power, it's a cliche to say that beneath the accepted history there are truths that have been subsumed, and yet it consistently shows up to be relatively true. That you look deeper at something like prohibition, at the ways in which the alcohol was used to subjugate or to control the disenfranchised.
Martine, you've got me thinking about gun rights too, like the freedom to not be shot
right.
in your school. Is that more important than someone's freedom to bear arms? That's so interesting.
I mean, the words matter, and I know that as a side note here, I was thinking about the words, the gendered words of power wielders. The words I'm thinking of, like hero and master and stud and warlock. Those are powerful words, and they're positive words. What is the female version of those words? Heroine, mistress, bitch, and witch. Isn't that fascinating how those do not have a positive connotation? They are the female equivalent.
Well, Martine, it's interesting that you bring up this gendered aspect, and Mark was talking about it as well. We have this received wisdom of the temperance movement as being these joyless, frigid, castrating old ladies, and that is not a coincidence that we have that image. That is something that the liquor industry very much invested in and pushed at the time. Mark is correct to say that, there was not national women's suffrage at the time that prohibition was passed, but that was in part because the liquor industry organized and lobbied very heavily to prevent women's suffrage amendments from passing in the states and also nationally. They hired speakers to go on the lecture circuit. They took out advertisements. They wrote these droolingly misogynist editorials. They published all these editorial cartoons, all this. If you've ever seen the anti-suffrage propaganda from the turn of the 20th century with, a woman in a high bun, knocking her husband over the head with a cane and saying, I'm the man now because I can vote. There's a lot of really obscene, funny propaganda from that time. But that was all paid for. Much of it was paid for by the liquor industry itself, specifically because they saw the leadership of women in the temperance movement and thought that women's votes could hurt their bottom line.
We are so lucky this season to be sponsored by Lytle Barnett, which is a brand I am personally a huge fan of. It's a collaboration between Oregon-born Andy Lytle, friend of the pod, and Anthony Beck of Graham Beck, the South African sparkling wine house. So Lytle Barnett grows outstanding Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and some Pinot Meunier even in the Yola-Amity Hills of the Willamette Valley. And of course, those are the grapes that are the building blocks for champagne. And Rachel and I are sitting here tasting these delicious wines, and we were just saying, we could be fooled. We could taste these wines blind and we would believe they were from Champagne. They're just absolutely delicious. Let's take a sip of the 2017 Blanc de Noir. That means it's the white of reds or white of blacks. So it's the white sparkling wine made from Pinot Noir. I'm getting kind of like a briny, salty note on this wine. It's making me think of the aforementioned champagne. The mousse is amazing. It's so frothy. It's so bubbly on the palate. It's absolutely divine. I'm getting super refreshing acidity. Rachel, what are you thinking about this wine?
I think this wine is a little bit more serious on the nose, but I love that. On the palate, I get kind of like aged, like wildflower honey, a little bit of dried apple, and like you're saying, that texture is just to die for.
Yum, yum, yum. Well, listeners, you've got to try these wines. They are total knockouts. Go to lytlebarnett.com to learn more about these wines. That's lytle-barnett.com. That's Lytle Barnett, sparkling wines from the Willamette Valley. Check them out. Thank you so much, Lytle Barnett, for sponsoring the Foretop. We love you guys. I am so delighted that Aubaine Winery is sponsoring this episode of The Foretop. It is just so easy to record these sponsor segments when I absolutely love the wines that we get to taste. I'm so excited because we get to taste some delicious Pinot Noir today, made by Aubaine's winemaker, the one and only Isabelle Meunier, who is, I would say, probably one of Oregon's top winemakers, probably in the top 3. She's really, really talented. Her resume includes stints at Domaine de la Vougerie in Burgundy, Felton Road in New Zealand, and working alongside Dominique Lafont here at Evening Land in Oregon. Isabelle's winemaking style is absolutely superb, and she knows the Yosemite Hills appellation of the Willamette Valley. She practices old world winemaking in the cellar with wild yeast fermentations, and I cannot wait to taste these 2 Aubaine Pinot Noirs we have here. These are both from the 2019 vintage, which is a vintage I really love for its restraint and balance. So what do we have here, Rachel? We have the Pinot Noir, and then we also have the Joie, which is their Reserve Pinot Noir. Let's taste the Pinot here. I am getting some refreshing bitter notes on this wine and some earthy notes, counterbalanced by tart raspberry, subtle tannins, and outstanding acidity. Rachel, what did you think of the Aubaine Pinot Noir we have here?
I think this is wine that is an absolute pleasure to drink. I get red currant, definitely some spice from that Pinot Noir, like allspice maybe, and then like you were saying, that like beautiful red raspberry there.
Yeah, this is a really delicious wine. Well, let's move on to the Joie. This is Joie, if you're looking it up. This is the Reserve Pinot Noir. Again, this is a single vineyard wine from the Anahata Vineyard in the Yosemite Hills, and I am definitely tasting that Yosemite Hills, that vibrancy, that electricity. I'm getting, I call it like a bee sting feeling at the finish. This wine has just got that electricity of the Yosemite Hills. It's a little rounder and spicier. Only 198 cases were produced of this very, very unique and rare Pinot Noir. Rachel, what do you think of the Joie Pinot Noir from Aubaine?
Yeah, like you're saying, I get a little bit more intensity from this wine, but in a really, really phenomenal way. It's a little bit darker fruit, more kind of like, to me, huckleberry, but with some earthiness there. All in all, it's super elegant, delicious to drink.
These are just outstanding Pinot Noirs from the Willamette Valley's Yosemite Hills. We are just so lucky to be able to taste these during our sponsor breaks. Thank you so much, Aubaine, for sponsoring the Foretop. We really appreciate you supporting us. Listeners, you've got to go learn more about these delicious wines. Go to aubainewine.com, that's AUBAINE wine.com, and learn more about Aubaine's delicious Yosemite Hills Pinot Noirs and Chardonnays. And Mark, tell us about Frederick Douglass was a big proponent of prohibition as well, wasn't he? And I didn't realize that until I started reading your work.
Yeah, I didn't either until I started writing the work, right? And so, but again, it just kind of came out of this kind of global perspective and recognizing that in many parts of the world, the people who were the biggest advocates against sort of this predatory liquor industry and the states that were behind them tended to be the most marginalized communities. And I still remember I got halfway through my book. I thought it was the end of the book, doing this kind of global tour. And I gave a presentation, here at Villanova. And one of my colleagues said, okay, if I'm going to believe your thesis that, temperance was about resistance to sort of predatory capitalism and the politics of imperialism, she said, where are the Native Americans in your story? And where are African Americans? And I was like, you're right. They're not there.
Yeah.
And that's what made this such a long book, because I had to write another 8 chapters to incorporate them. And when you start to look at that, you find that, America's first prohibitionists were its first peoples, were Native Americans. And then also, African Americans. And so Frederick Douglass, along with abolitionists, a lot of white abolitionists and African American abolitionists, understood, that alcohol was a type of slavery. The argument was being made by a lot of these abolitionists that, especially after the Civil War, you did not want to have sort of the bonds of servitude, of black servitude, going from the white slave owner, and just have those bonds being transferred over to the white saloon keeper. The idea was that you're still in bondage, you're still subservient, to a slave master or to somebody else for their economic profit, and that became sort of one of these common elements. And so it was very interesting to see that that sort of the strongest areas of temperance before the Civil War tended to be African American groups. They had their own indigenous temperance organizations, because oftentimes they wouldn't be allowed in white temperance organizations. And some of the greatest leaders of abolitionism were card carrying temperance members and prohibitionists, including your Abraham Lincolns and Frederick Douglasses.
Mark, I was struck by that comment that you, a sentence you wrote in an article where you said they'd introduced industrial, and by they, at the time, European colonizers, they introduced industrially distilled liquors to native populations with no history or tolerance for alcohol. Recoil in horror at the drunkenness that would ensue, and then point to that same drunkenness as evidence of the natives' innate inferiority.
Right. That was like the playbook, the international alcohol playbook for imperialism. And you find it, once you see that, it happens time and again. You had this is what the Irish were complaining about when it came to their subservience to the British. It was what the Africans, Native Africans, saw in South Africa and Bechuanaland, which is now Botswana, in Zaire, and in India and in Australia and in Native, it's like, it's the same thing everywhere. It's that same exact playbook of here's something that's just going to blow your mind that you don't have. And now, I guess the other thing that comes with that is that if you're a European explorer, and you're coming into some sort of in native tribe or indigenous population, some subaltern population, they've been going for hundreds, if not thousands of years without you. You're not necessary. You don't bring anything to them. But if you introduce to them distilled alcohol and you get them addicted to it, they don't have the ability to produce that. And so suddenly you've made yourself from being completely expendable to being absolutely instrumental, right? To the point that they will trade anything to get more liquor. And so that's one of the reasons why there are a lot of historians who kind of point out that a lot of European colonization happened less, at the end of a gun barrel and more with a liquor bottle in hand.
Yeah, it was really interesting researching this episode because, of course, I was thinking of episode 97 of the Four Top. If you all have not heard it, I encourage listeners to tune in which Stephen Satterfield of Netflix's High on the Hog joined us to talk about what's essentially an indentured servitude system in South Africa that, it's believed to no longer exist, but there's still some reports that it still exists on some South African vineyards to this day. And this is in the wine industry, where workers are paid, quote, paid in booze, and they're unable to flee their situation because they have no income and they're dependent upon the alcohol they're producing. And we heard about a similar situation in southern Italy, where workers are essentially enslaved and become dependent upon alcohol. I'm also thinking about episode 100 of the Four Top, as Mark was speaking about our indigenous population and the associations that we have between, indigenous people and alcohol. And Elaine Chukon Brown joined us and explained that, there's this this pop cultural myth that Indigenous people are more likely to be alcoholics, and it's not true. It's genetically not true. It's because of this pattern that Mark has relayed to us of colonizing people coming in and getting populations addicted to this substance that they hadn't had access to previously. And so it created this myth that Indigenous people are more likely to become alcoholics, but it's really just not true. And we just need to overturn, when I was thinking about this episode, I kept thinking we need to repeal our ideas about prohibition. Mark, getting back to what you were saying about colonization, I was thinking about the Opium Wars. It's so interesting that in high school and college, I remember learning about the Opium Wars, about how the British East India Company came into China and sort of almost forced the Chinese populace to become addicted to opium. But we never learned this story about alcohol. It just wasn't. I don't remember it being taught in our history classes.
Yeah, that's right, Catherine. And I mean, it's especially within the British Empire, it was the same dynamics, just different drugs in different places. And so, opium for the Chinese, and alcohol usually for for the Indians, and for the the Africans in South Africa, and the Irish, and anybody across the Middle East and in Turkey when they occupied those areas. So it's it's similar dynamics, sometimes just a slightly different drug.
Yeah. Well, I do want to return to the present day. I find it kind of interesting that Prohibition turned 100 at the height of the Me Too era. And we are actually joined today by a Me Too superstar. Moira, you famously started the Shitty Media Men list. And if our listeners have not come across that, definitely Google it and read about it. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about how alcohol continues to play into the sexual assault narrative today.
Oh, thank you, Catherine. That's really kind of you. And there's a reason I have this soft spot for Carrie Nation, is because I also, when I was younger, had this gesture of feminist direct action, right? And took what some people understood as a extremist intervention to try and protect women from sexual harassment and sexual assault. Alcohol it sort of troubles a lot of our notions of free will, right? Like drinking, intoxication, addiction. It makes those things kind of blurry, but you do see a recurring correlation between alcohol use and violence, and particularly like violent crime. And that's not exclusive to gender violence. Like other kinds of violence also become more frequent the more people are drinking. But there is a connection to gender violence and alcohol that was particularly highlighted by the temperance movement, and which comes up a lot in our discussions of sexual violence today. And I think that it's a little bit of a bugger to talk about this, because you wind up with messaging that links drinking to sexual violence that is directed at women. An article appears every August as college students are going back to campus, and it's something to the effect of like, college girls, don't get too drunk, because if you get too drunk, the boys will take advantage of you. And it's interesting because I wonder, like, we do have perpetrator directed public health and public safety messaging around alcohol, and we have it with drunk driving, right? We don't say don't drive late at night because some people are drunk and they might crash into you. We say don't get drunk and drive because you could hurt somebody. And it's interesting and conspicuous to me that our messaging about the link between alcohol and sexual violence is directed so much at the potential victims, who ultimately have less control than at the potential perpetrators, who should also have a stake in preventing this, and could probably be a little more effective at doing so.
Mm-hmm. So, Moira, I've got to ask you what you think about the whole trend in recent years of marketing wines to women, sort of tongue-in-cheek. There are these whole mommy wines and all these sort of jokey wine brands out there that seem to be trying to turn a whole generation of women into alcoholics. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this.
You do see an increase in marketing of alcohol to women, and it's corresponding with an increase in women's alcohol consumption, although women still drink on the whole less than men do. And yeah, Catherine, you're right, because in a lot of these marketing campaigns, there's this kind of like winking nod to like women not being very happy or like women being like too stressed out. Like, I think before we were recording just now, Martine mentioned like the almost meme joke of like mommy needs her juice. And listen, every working mother is a hero. Every working mother deserves a plaque and a parade. And if they need to unwind at the end of a long day of being a professional and a mom and, you know, God knows how many other roles they've fulfilled, like, go for Christ's sake, have the glass of wine. Like, they deserve it. But on the other hand, it does, like, this winking acknowledgement of how stressed out and overworked mothers are points at a much bigger social problem that a glass of wine actually can't fix, you know? So I wonder if we might be seeing a little bit of the dynamic that Mark was talking about how people whose labor and you know their working capacity is being a little bit exploited or not compensated fairly are being sort of plied off with alcohol. There's maybe a similar dynamic at play, and you know I want to say to working mothers, like, yeah, have the wine, and then also like you also need politics. You also need a feminist movement and a more robust welfare state, because there can't be this much pressure on you all the time. It's just not sustainable.
Well said, Moira.
You know, as we finish up, I'm just curious to hear from both of our guests. We're really a podcast that's concerned mostly with the wine industry. We are people who are in the wine trade or are wine lovers, enthusiasts, and we come to alcohol with this totally positive connotation that it's this blissful industry to work in where we farm beautiful vineyards and we make people happy and we sing "I Feel Pretty" to each other, you know. This episode is just kind of, you know, I think Martine was quoting Mark's article where he used the term recoil in horror. I am recoiling in horror at the industry I know and love. And I'm just curious, what sort of parting thoughts would you both have for those of us in the wine industry? What should we be aware of?
That's a simple question, of course.
You know, I think in many ways the wine industry and the alcohol, the liquor trade, as you know they used to call it, is back in the day. It's not the same nowadays as it used to be. It's not predatory. You don't have to worry about the barkeeper. The saloon keeper is not also the you know, he's not also the pawnbroker in the neighborhood who's trying to take everything that you own, right? You know, there seem to be better ethics associated with the market, sort of recognition of the downsides of it as well. And it's not just sort of like a, you know, sort of just kind of acknowledging and kind of moving on. But I mean, these are deeply ingrained understandings that, you know, sometimes just need to be pointed out. And sometimes maybe a little romp through history allows us to kind of take stock and look at the present and say, oh, okay, well, these are things that have changed quite dramatically since the bad old days of the past.
Thanks, Mark. And Moira, what about you?
Yeah, I think I sort of have like some similar sentiments to what Mark does. You know, if alcohol was only evil and didn't give anybody anything good in their lives, then like prohibition would have worked, and there wouldn't be any sort of problem with overconsumption. You know, because people who consume too much consume because they like are chasing the things that are good about alcohol, the way it like lubricates our social lives and can bring our you know, relationships closer. So there's a lot of good that it does for the world, as well as this, you know, these darker parts that we've been dwelling on. But also, like, I think people, you know, this is maybe touching more on Mark's point. I think people have really developed a very different relationship to alcohol now, especially post pandemic. You see a lot of people sort of reassessing the role it plays in their lives, and maybe taking a step back from like a higher consumption level that they were more accustomed during quarantine. And I don't think that has to be bad news for the wine industry. I think, this balance between alcohol's many benefits and its like pretty dramatic dark sides is something that everybody who has any kind of relationship to alcohol is getting accustomed to exploring.
What Moira said was fascinating about how if it was only evil, alcohol, then prohibition was a good thing, full stop. But it's not, and the opposite is also can't be true, which is wine and alcohol isn't just all good. And frankly, I think it mirrors a lot of what we talk about with our own country, right? The way we hold the U.S. as a symbol of a force for good, and therefore some people say, well, we can't criticize. Well, it's okay to look critically at our country. We still love it, and it's okay to look at both, warts and all. It's not a purely good society and country, and there's plenty of reasons to look critically at it, and in doing so advance and progress to reach to attempt to reach the values and the country that our values say we are. I think the same thing is true with alcohol and with wine. I really appreciate that, the fact that we can look at something critically while still loving it.
Well, I think that's a really lovely note to end on. And since it's quite late on the East Coast, I am going to transition us to our dessert wine course, where we go around our virtual table here and each person shares something wonderful that they've been enjoying this week that maybe has something to do with food and wine, but not necessarily. Moira.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I hope you guys appreciate this, because I have been absolutely obsessed lately with this Irish public television cooking show called Lords and Ladles. Has anybody ever seen this?
No, it sounds amazing.
Okay.
No.
It is 3 Irish professional chefs, and they are adorable. They have like these beautiful musical Irish accents. And the premise is that they drive around Ireland to these various like stately homes, like old castles, and manors, and they use the kitchens there to prepare a meal that would have been served during the castle's heyday. So they're always like fretting over aspic and trying to like get the aga to work, and it is such pure comfort television, and I highly recommend it if you guys can find it.
Oh my gosh, where can we find it? Is it on Netflix? Where is it?
I watched some of it on YouTube, actually, because there's a funny, I guess, like Irish TV licensing issue, so it's a little hard to access in the US. But I definitely recommend it if you can get a hold of it.
That sounds amazing. Martine, how about you?
I'm actually going to go for a non-edible dessert course here, and it is actually, funny enough, a phone charger. I'm becoming more and more of a sustainability and resilience, wine resilience, and ecological zealot. And so I wanted to point people in the direction of something called Nimble. It is a company that does phone chargers, portable, otherwise, line, charging up your phone, your laptop, everything. Why not tap into our desire to consume and buy new things and our obsession with technology? Tap into that buying habit and plug in something that's better for the planet.
So, Martine, you just plugged a plug.
Oh!
You said he was the
wow!
one who
I love this, Catherine. You won the day.
Oh, thank you. Well, I still have to share my dessert course, and it's a little hat tip to our guests as well. And that is, when I was researching this episode, my searches just kept pulling up articles from The Atlantic. And it turns out that both of our guests have contributed some really fantastic pieces to The Atlantic. So just get on that website and browse around and put our guests' names, Moira Donegan and Mark Lawrence Schrad, in the search field, and you will come up with some fantastic articles. But I also discovered that The Atlantic has just been covering the alcohol beat really thoroughly for years. So I just want to recommend that, and then share just a little warm, fuzzy personal memory, which is that I kind of almost dropped out of school my senior year in college to intern at The Atlantic. And as I was thinking about this last night, I realized I think part of the reason I do what I do was one of my assignments there was to write an advertorial feature about the history of cacao. And I got super deep and nerdy into the, history of drinking cacao. And here I am 30 years later, still writing about flavor and beverages. So who knew?
And so, Mark, I think it's your turn to introduce your dessert course, whatever it is.
Well, I'll have to admit that I'm not much of a wine drinker, but if I were a wine drinker, I'm in one of those positions where I don't know good from bad, but I know what I like. And what I like, based upon my previous experiences, especially in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, is Georgian wines. And so one of the things I really have always liked is, from that experience is that you could get a cheap bottle of Huanchkara or Kinsmara Uli as these wonderful semi-sweet, Georgian wines that were just absolutely wonderful. And I'll tell you very briefly, the way I was turned on to them one time is I was living in Russia. We went to Sochi, which is where they had the Olympics in 2014. But this was 20 years before then. And we were up in these beautiful mountains with these waterfalls, and we ran into this old Georgian lady at the top of this mountain, and she had a little spread where she had wine, but it was all homemade wine, and it was in these dingy green 2-liter plastic bottles that said 7-Up on them. And we're like, oh, okay, this is not good. We don't want anything to do with this. This is probably the least sanitary, least decent thing I could possibly imagine. But we struck up this conversation. We were talking in Russian and talking about Georgia, talking about all these wonderful things. And at the very end, she says, here, have a free sample. We drank this, and it was just pure magic. It was just pure love. And we bought out her entire stock and came gleefully charging down this mountaintop with 2-liter plastic 2-liter bottles full of wine. And that was back before 9/11, so you could actually take them on airplanes. And we were drinking on airplanes 2-liter bottles of Georgian wine, homemade the entire time. And it was some of the best stuff I think I've ever had.
That is a fabulous story.
That is a great story.
Love that. And thank you so much to our brilliant panelists.
Yes, you can find Moira Donegan's columns online at theguardian.com.
And you can find many articles about prohibition online by Mark Lawrence Schrad, Associate Professor of Political Science at Villanova University. But better yet, just buy his book. It's called Smashing the Liquor Machine, A Global History of Prohibition.
You are not prohibited to check his website out. And you can find me, Martin Reyes, at reyeswinegroup.com. Maybe other couple of places too. This is certified sustainable.wine, possibly even napathrives.org. I know there's always things that are happening here, but anyways, that's where you can find me.
Busy, busy, busy. And you can find me, Catherine Cole, at catherinecole.com. But better yet, just go to theforetop.org and please get in touch with us. You can find our social media handles on our website. And we want to hear how this episode repealed your opinions about prohibition. Also, please subscribe to The Foretop on your favorite podcast app and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts so others can find the pod. Signing out here from the high-fiber, protein-packed city of Portland, Oregon, thank you so much for listening.
This has been the Foretop Podcast. Catherine Cole is our executive producer, Izzy Kramer is our senior producer, and I'm Keelan King, sound supervisor. We are also assisted by audio editor, Michelle Richards, our production assistant, Rachel Grossman, creative assistant, Lex Rule, and editorial assistant, Nick Toole. Please visit our website, theforetop.org, to learn more about us, listen to back episodes, reach out to us on social media, and purchase books written by our amazing panelists. And if you have not already subscribed to The Foretop on iTunes or Spotify, please do so and leave us a rating. Stay safe out there, and thanks for listening.